Welcome to another exciting season of the Expanding on Consciousness podcast. I am Mark Certo, and I'd like to start off the season with an apology for our long break between seasons. We have our reasons, and the primary reason is you. We know that the reason you tune into this podcast is for the truth and accuracy we bring. We also know that you're very serious about the exploration and the conversation about what it means to expand consciousness. We know you're bright, intelligent, and curious beings who are awakening and expanding consciousness, so the producers Robert Neville, Jenny Wedeby, and I take our job very seriously. Our goal is to bring you premium content filled with the words of people who bring a lot of gravitas, depth, and experience to this conversation. Our goal is to keep this conversation and podcast well above the threshold of other offerings available on the net. The guiding principle of this podcast is integrity, not clickbait or getting the story out there first. That requires research and time. It's the same guiding principle that has driven the Monroe Institute for over 50 years regarding the conversation of expanded consciousness. The Institute has always quietly gone about its work, and we leave the hype to others. Our guests are of the same ilk. They're researchers who have dedicated their entire lives to the great work of expanding consciousness. So if you're listening to this podcast, we know you too are obviously of that same mindset. So that's why we took our time with the release of Season 3. Our goal was to find the most interesting and informative guests whose integrity matched the overarching theme that guides this conversation. And the conversation continues to expand in this season with an incredible lineup of guests, including Rupert Sheldrake, Dr. Raymond Moody, both Don Miguel and Don Jose Ruiz, and Professor Robert Temple, to name a few. These amazing people who spearheaded a long tradition of truth-tellers and explorers, and I'm very grateful they chose this podcast to speak about their work and expand the conversation beyond the sound bites and sensation. So before we get into the meat of what Season 3 reveals, I'd like to share with all of you listening that the producers and I have noticed a pattern emerging in the conversation of consciousness. This wasn't a planned idea, but it is something which speaks to consciousness revealed rather than intended. Revelation is something I personally marvel at. Robert and Jenny have noticed this as well, and perhaps you've noticed it too. There has been an overarching theme to this conversation of consciousness which seems to be revealing itself. In a word, that overarching theme is interconnectedness. Another word for it was coined by Carl Jung many years ago, and it's a word that I really like to describe this phenomenon. The word is synchronicity. This idea of being interconnected is, for some, just a concept. For others, it's self-evident. That disparity is primarily because of the way in which one experiences consciousness. Most people experience consciousness on a personal level only, which I believe is somewhat intentional. Those who explore altered states of consciousness find that there's something more going on. At some point in their explorations, they come to the revelation that there is more to the story of consciousness than meets the eye, something that gets beyond the personal narrative which governs one's perception of reality. Those revelations begin an expansion of personal consciousness, which opens the gates of the mystery of consciousness. And once those gates are open, synchronicity becomes a beacon which seems to let us know that we're on the right track. It also gives us some very real clues about the interconnectedness of things. Now, synchronicity, for those of you who don't know, can actually be defined in a couple of ways. The most popular definition of the word synchronicity is meaningful coincidences. Another implies an implicate order to things, an interlinking principle between seemingly different things. Perhaps that link is information, which allows us to know things which should not be available to us. Kind of like in psychic functioning. For others, the phenomenon speaks to something much more powerful on a personal level. A reflection of sorts having to do with one's personal awareness and how we co-create physical reality. Synchronicity actually has a lot of meanings and implications which are pretty much reflected in the stories and presentations that our guests have brought us so far in the 3 seasons that we've explored. And they'll probably continue to be the overarching theme as we continue this conversation. That overarching theme is that we are not as separate from each other as we'd like to believe. If you carry this idea in the background of your mind as you listen to each and every one of our guests in all 3 seasons, you too might see what Robert, Jenny, and I see. For instance, in seasons 1 and 2, you hear a lot from consciousness researchers and academics from a variety of disciplines in the vast field of consciousness studies, and they all speak to this interconnectedness of things as being the reason for the phenomenon they study. Psi researchers speak of the information as being contained within an accessible realm which enables psychics such as remote viewers or channelers and others to do what they do. It's as if the information flows freely once one gets out of their personal sense of consciousness and gets it out of the way. And the same applies for what is referred to as energetic healing or psychoneuroimmunology. Scientists are observing that the body can maintain homeostasis or recover from illness or even change the rate at which entropy occurs in the body due to a shift in consciousness. It's a shift that includes both the direction of personal consciousness, or intention if you like, and an allowance at the same time or openness to an even greater impersonal type of consciousness. That greater consciousness is often referred to as energy. All of this seems to imply that energy, consciousness, and information are somehow linked and have an effect in physical time-space or third-dimensional reality. Coincidentally, or not so coincidentally, the question of reality and the interlinking principle is also reflected in my conversations with researchers in quantum field theory in seasons 1 and 2. Those scientists are telling us a few things about consciousness that goes way beyond our personal sense of it. And slowly, we are coming to the knowledge that consciousness is fundamental and it exists outside of the brain. That its origins are outside of you and me and everything else we experience in reality. And somehow, perhaps through our personal sense of consciousness, we are interacting with this impersonal consciousness. This field of study also tells us that energy and information and reality itself, as we experience it, are interlinked to create a sensation that we call our lives, or life itself. It's like we're living in some sort of hologram with which we are interacting and co-creating in real time, the 4th dimension of interlinked time and space. In seasons 1 and 2, these scientists have spoken about this interconnectedness, and that only adds to the mystery of the multidimensional nature of this thing that we call consciousness. This information connects to what the mystics have spoken about for centuries. They didn't quite have the lexicon or perhaps the peer-reviewed observable scientific ability to show that what they were saying is true, but it seems true nonetheless. It seems that when it came to the mystery of consciousness, the mystics actually have had it right all along. Everything is connected, and all of existence is actually multidimensional. That includes you, that includes me. And this is what Jungian theory and, say, the mystical tradition of Kabbalah have in common. To make matters even more fascinating, to me at least, is that the mystery of consciousness is revealing itself, and at the same time, it's expanding to include or create a greater sense of mystery. It's almost as if the minute we unlock something, some form of intelligence outside of ourselves says, "Oh, you got that. Good. Nice that you reached this line. Now come over to here." And into the void we go. And that's why my favorite question, which I ask all of the guests, is, how do you define consciousness? The answer that I get from them, regardless of what discipline they come from, is always very similar. They say things like, "I'm not sure how to answer that question." No one, regardless of what knowledge they possess, what information they have amassed through a lifetime of study, really seems to know what consciousness is, let alone possesses a truth about it. It's like the far reaches of the universe still being a mystery, one that we're exploring and expanding together. I find it so interesting that the one thing we all share, the one thing we share amongst ourselves as humans, amongst the plants and animals who breathe the exact same air we do, perhaps even the earth itself, that this thing called consciousness is something that we rarely speak of amongst each other. This podcast aims to shift that and provide a respectful, thoughtful, and intriguing dialogue which hopefully will inspire a much larger dialogue among you, the listeners, and others who aren't even aware that this conversation is going on, let alone worth having. In my humble opinion, we are all exploring this mystery of consciousness together and contributing to an unfolding story of consciousness. If we can get to that understanding, if we can somehow get to the understanding of how this energy, information, and flow is occurring, we might just find one of the great keys about ourselves and our place in the universe. This is something humankind has pondered for a very long time. That pondering also is a function of consciousness, something most of us share, and it speaks to not only the existing life that you and I are living in this moment, but also speaks to how one might use one's personal sense of consciousness to make life even better and help others to do so as well. In this respect, we're all interlinked. And that makes me wonder a lot of things about the current condition and state of our world. This conversation also includes the desire to know something about the nature of consciousness beyond the confines of the physical, meaning consciousness as it exists beyond the body. This is something which my friend Bob Monroe devoted half of his life to understanding and created a place of inquiry known as the Monroe Institute to engage others in this line of inquiry. It's a place where science and spirituality could meet in a very non-dogmatic fashion. Yes, spirituality is a function of consciousness as well, and it too has a seat at the table in this conversation. In this podcast, we do not exclude or cancel the views of those who believe consciousness survives the physical brain any more than we would cancel or exclude the views of those who believe that consciousness is a product of the physical brain. Neither do we strive to postulate that it does survive the physical brain. We do not cancel or exclude those who have deeply held religious convictions. Neither do we proselytize that any view of what occurs in, say, an afterlife is accurate or absolute. We simply allow all voices to be heard, and we let you, the listener, decide. Bob's one maxim for the Institute is that it is possible for anyone to find such things out for themselves through direct experience, and that maxim is in place today. So in Season 3, the conversation continues to include some of those voices. You'll be hearing from several people who will speak of the interconnectedness of things through the lens of religious or philosophical expressions of consciousness. They'll speak to the ethics implied through such practices and, perhaps, inspire a new view of what is possible. You'll also be hearing from scientists who share decades of research around the near-death experience, and hear from a scientist who speaks of the field in which all of life is interacting, the field which is in itself conscious. So this conversation expands as the mind expands. And one thing I know for certain is that consciousness and everything else in the universe/multiverse is expanding and evolving. This much I believe we can all agree on. That implies to me that we humans have a great power and responsibility in that expansion process. We're doing so consciously. We are making decisions which will have an effect on the way that we evolve, on the way that we expand. One thing that both scientists and mystics can also agree on is that everything is evolving into something else. And you are part of that evolution on both a personal and impersonal level. You're part of the story of consciousness, a personal story and a collective story, and that makes you very special in my way of thinking. I pay no mind to whether we agree on everything or not. I know who I am, and I know who you are. And we're both expressions, in my view. We are both expressions of this thing called consciousness. The same thing applies for everything I experience in my daily life, both physically and non-physically. For me, everything is an expression of consciousness, and that mindset helps me in myriad ways. I also believe that if more people awakened to this as a truth, not because I'm saying so, but because they have a direct experience of it, that collectively and individually we will do something extraordinary in the story of consciousness. We'll come to know something about the real nature of singularity and why it is in need of an expression through this thing called polarity or diversity. I could go on about this for hours, but you don't need to hear it from me. If you have the senses to allow for experience and the desire to expand your own personal sense of consciousness beyond the familiar, to quote my friend Bob Monroe, you'll be able to find out for yourself. So I sincerely hope that you enjoy Season 3 as much as I have. I hope it inspires something within you that motivates you to reach beyond the familiar, and I hope it helps you expand. Thank you for listening.
Be certain to tune in again to Expanding on Consciousness to become informed on the fascinating field of consciousness studies and its applications. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the guests and the host. They do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the Monroe Institute. Expanding on Consciousness is underwritten and produced by the Monroe Institute, copyright 2023, and is broadcast by permission. Reproduction or redistribution without the express written consent of Monroe Institute is prohibited by law. For more information about Expanding on Consciousness, visit our website at monroeinstitute.org or connect with us on the socials. Thank you for listening.